Morning, everyone. It's 10:30 and we're almost ready to go on today's session. We're just going to give it a minute or so for a few more people to join, and then we'll kick things off pretty swiftly. Okay, so I think we've got around 100 or so plus on the call now. So we are going to make a start. So thanks everyone for joining, first of all. Today's session will be the first in a series of 4 that we're going to be running across the next couple of days, where we're exploring the key components of the Power Platform. And as I'm sure you're aware, today's session will focus on Power Apps, with the other sessions homing in on Power Automate, Power BI, virtual agents, which you can still register for, and watch on demand if that's more convenient for yourself. We have got quite a bit of content to cover on today's session, so if you could keep your cameras and mics off, that would be really helpful for the benefit of all on the call. Just briefly before we get into it, just wanted to reference the speakers that we have on today's call. So we have Aaron Gums, who heads up the customer engagement and Power Apps practice at Quantix. Aaron has a whole plethora of experience as a consultant working on a really wide variety of Dynamics and also Power Platform projects. So he is well versed to explore and present these technologies on today's session. And we also have Scott, who's the applications delivery manager at Norfolk County Council. He's been very closely aligned to all things Power Apps and BI, and who will be detailing a previous Power Platform project at Norfolk and how that's really helped to transform the business, and he's also going to describe some of the key benefits they've been able to realize through the platform. And lastly, hopefully not least, myself, business applications specialist at Bytes, where I am essentially aligned to all things Power Platform and Dynamics. So, and if we go on to the next slide, here's what to expect from a content perspective on today's session. So we are going to start with an overview of Power Apps. You know, what are the different types of apps that can be created? When would you use, for example, a Canvas app? When would you potentially deploy a model-driven app? And then we're going to introduce the idea of Power Apps portals, and also the concept of Dataverse. What do we mean by Dataverse? How do we define it? We will explore the citizen portal offering from Quantix, which is essentially an engagement designed and delivered to make sure clients are aware of and understand really the true value and the capabilities of each type of application. Then Aaron is going to describe the value of utilizing the same data sources across multiple applications. And as reference, Scott will describe the transformation really that has taken place at Norfolk Council, of which several Microsoft technologies, including the Power Platform, has played a really significant role there. And lastly, to finish things, we will describe our services, you know, one of our workshop offerings, and how that can really enhance and expedite your Power Platform journey. In fact, you should see a flyer in the chat window very shortly around one of our offerings, if that isn't already in there. And just as a little heads up, you will have the possibility to ask questions throughout the session, and when we are at a later point in the session, we will look to answer many of those questions. We might not get around to all of them on today's call, but rest assured, those that we don't, we will take offline. And if we just go on to the next slide, please, Aaron. Just to briefly reference today's case study, as mentioned, we do have Scott from Norfolk Council on today's call, who will kind of elaborate on it in much more detail. But just at high level, Norfolk envisioned a digital strategy that was designed to benefit the public, drive business growth, and also ensure that everyone has access to modern technology, as well as enhancing operations within the council in order to drive a efficient service delivery. And there were three key components in that strategy. They were digital citizen, digital employee, and better use of data. The first, so digital citizen, focused on equipping the citizens with the necessary skills and tools, services, and ultra-fast broadband. Digital employee was designed around ensuring that the council staff have the technology required to be productive, and also better use of data. So having the ability to make informed decisions about the service delivery using the right data. In order to execute each component, Norfolk decided they wanted to leverage Microsoft technologies, which required technical support to ensure that the adoption was managed effectively, as well as commercial advice from a Bytes perspective to get the best value from the platform. And it was actually the Bytes cloud solutions team that then helped Norfolk Council to implement their chosen product, their chosen group of Microsoft solutions, which include M365, Dynamics 365, and also Power BI and Power Apps, which obviously we're particularly interested in the context of today's call. So again, Scott will do a far more sort of elaborate and deep dive into that kind of story on a bit further down the road in this call. But to start with, we're going to hand over to Aaron, who's going to give a high-level positioning of Power Apps and start by defining Microsoft Dataverse and why it's important. So over to you, Aaron.
Perfect, thanks, Sam. So to start our presentation today and talk about Power Apps in more detail, we just need to set the scene a little bit, just aware that everyone in the room may come from different backgrounds and have different understandings of the Microsoft Cloud and everything that we can do in the Power Platform and other terms such as Dataverse and Dynamics 365. And we're going to do that first of all by looking at the Microsoft Cloud terminology in context of the diagram that Microsoft provide, before talking about why Power Apps and why the Dataverse is so important. So we have this diagram on the right hand side, which explains how Microsoft positioned the Power Platform and all of the core functionality within the Power Platform itself. But there are underlying parts of those services that we really need to pay special attention to. So as you can see on the right hand side, we have the four key services: Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, and Power Virtual Agents. They're the four key services that we'll be talking about in this series over the course of today and tomorrow. So Microsoft Dataverse sits underneath these services, and it's the underlying data source provided by Microsoft that lives within the Power Platform. The real thing about this is making sure that we have a single source of truth and that we're always referencing a common set of data structures and models underneath our services. And Dataverse includes a series of tables, columns, and rows, as you'd expect in a database. It can interact with external data sources via the Power Automate product, and we can surface data externally through Power Apps portals, as well as keeping it internal with business application end users as well. So the reason for today's session is obviously to talk about Power Apps, and we're going to talk about the three different types that we have in detail, and Dataverse sits underneath all of these three as a possible data source. When we're talking about Power Apps, as I just said, we've got three different types of Power Apps available. We have model-driven apps, we have Canvas apps, and we have the portal product as well. So we're going to go through all of those in detail and just have a look at the differences on when we should choose one of those particular apps. When you actually log into your Microsoft Cloud tenant and you're looking at the Power Platform and Dynamics 365, what you'll see is that Microsoft provide a series of templates, accelerators, and also pre-configured Dynamics 365 applications. Depending on which type you're choosing will depend on how much is given to you and how much will need to be implemented by you or by a partner. So templates are normally to give you the idea, but actually you need to configure the whole thing yourself. The accelerators are really common industry standard scenarios where a lot of your operational processes will be aligned to what they're doing in the accelerators, but it might need a little bit of extension. And then last but not least, we have the Dynamics 365 applications such as sales, customer service, marketing, and others that perform a particular function with particular departments in your business. One thing to note is the product has come a very long way over the last sort of 5 years or so. So the products that did exist before the Power Platform was a thing, they've all been built again from the ground up, and they're all built to be mobile responsive and to be accessible on any device, you know, that we commonly use in the world today. So whether it's a desktop browser, whether it's a tablet, there's always an application or a window to it via the device web browser. And the application will respond in the most applicable way. So that's an idea of the terminology. Let's have a look at the different types of applications as well as the context of Power Apps and Dataverse now. So first up, we have the model-driven application. And if there's anyone that's in the room familiar with Dynamics, what was called CRM, and now Dynamics 365 and the various applications from that suite, you might be very familiar with this interface already. This interface is really for kind of critical path business process thinking, you know, where you've got lots of data that you need to reference between different tables, where you might need branching conditions for different processes that you're going through, and where you may change ownership of records and data as it goes through a particular process. So this is really good for desk-based users, and this is where the Power Platform and Dynamics 365 kind of originally came from with its CRM product. And we have the flexibility now to completely configure the sitemaps to be tailored to the end users. So going back to our conversation about Dataverse and why it's so important as a single source of truth, we can use the same underlying tables that we're using in Dataverse for multiple applications, but we can give different windows and different visibility of that data in different model-driven applications and other types of Power Apps as well. We've already touched on this already, but there are a series of pre-configured solutions, and anything that comes under the Dynamics 365 customer engagement banner is effectively a model-driven app that's been enhanced for a particular business operational process. We then have the Canvas app, which is the newer type of app in the Power Platform. So the Canvas app is really ideal for users on the go or for purposes where you have one particular process and it needs to do one thing well in a tailored way. So the main difference between a model-driven app and a Canvas app is that you have complete control over the user interface in a Canvas app. You can see on the screen here, we've got an internal timesheet application at Quantix. We thought it'd be a good idea to use Canvas apps rather than model-driven apps because it needs to be visual with selecting dates. We need to be able to select date ranges that we can filter by, and all of those drop downs at the top of the screen need to be dynamically calculated on the fly as the person changes those date ranges and the products that they're looking at. We also need to be able to select multiple records and do different things with them as we're submitting or rejecting them. So the Canvas app was the perfect reason to use, was the perfect solution for this particular type of application. And whilst the users aren't necessarily on the go in this particular example, it's a really good example of needing to carry out one relatively simple process, but in a very highly customizable user interface. The last thing to be aware of for Canvas applications is that it uses a programming language called PowerFX. Now, the architecture that sits behind Canvas apps has always been Excel-like programming. And earlier this year, kind of the end of last year, Microsoft hinted towards making that language universal across the Power Platform via a brand called PowerFX. So I would say if you're comfortable with formulas such as VLOOKUP and looking at references for things like that, then you'd probably be quite comfortable getting started with a Canvas app. And they're a great way to get started with the Power Platform if you're not too familiar with it already. The third and final type of application is the Power Apps Portals product. Now, depending on kind of your history with the product and also who you're speaking to at Microsoft and the context of your requirement, sometimes this is described as an add-on to Power Apps. Sometimes it's considered a Power App in its own right. So you might see a slight change in terminology depending on how you're processing that with your requirements. But ultimately, from our perspective and from a technical perspective, it's its own app in its own right. It uses Dataverse as its primary data source for all of its data. And the great thing about portals is when we're doing portal projects at Quantix and at Bytes, we're really thinking about the content that we're showing on the screen and the way that that changes depending on who's logged in or who's not logged in. We're not having to do integration projects, which is fantastic. They're traditionally costly. They're time consuming and they carry a lot of risk. All of the data exchange between the front end on the portal and the data in Dataverse is taken care of by Microsoft via a safe and secure API and a series of programming statements that are available in the application. As with the other types of applications, we have several pre-configured starter templates that we can use as well. What I'd say about these, though, is they're normally tied to Dynamics 365 products. So you have a starter template that you can use with any configuration in the Power Platform whatsoever. But for example, you might have a self-service customer support portal template that's available with the customer service backend application via Dynamics 365. So there are some variations on how you can get started with portals, but ultimately you're not starting from scratch when you're trying to allow external audiences a window into your data. The other use case for Power Apps portals is not just for external audiences, but also for internal audiences as well. So there's a lot of functionality that's been built in to self-serve. The great thing about this is you can have knowledge bases, you can have community forums, you can have exchanges of conversations between individuals internally at your organization. And a portal is a really good way to be able to do that. There's a few reasons why you might want to do it from a user interface point of view, but it's also a good way to display kind of helpful information so people can get on with their troubleshooting by themselves and you're kind of deflecting tickets and queries from humans. So that's the three types of applications. And again, just want to reiterate how important that Dataverse is and that it's the single source of truth that we need to be considering when we're interacting with these three types of applications. What you can see here is a screenshot of the account table or entity, as it was called before, in Dataverse. And this is one of the core tables that Microsoft provides in the product. Now, Microsoft provide a set of core tables such as account, contact, and other ones such as user and all sorts of different things, but we can create our own, we can extend those tables and we can package those up into solutions so that they're deployable and maintainable across multiple environments. So some of you in the room will be familiar with this, but you can have, a scenario where you have a dev, a test, a UAT, a training, and a production environment that are maintained consistently because you can wrap all of this in a solution container. Now, the other great thing about this is, first of all, you can have virtual tables. So if you have any third-party data sources that you need to reference, you, again, don't need to necessarily have an integration. You might be able to use existing connectors to put data into your tables, or you might be able to use virtual tables. Now, virtual tables are windows into other data sources, and you can interact with them in very similar way to tables that aren't virtual in Dataverse. And it's a great way to be able to bring all of that data together and kind of contextualize it in your single source of truth. And then last but not least, as we're saying there again, really, just to reiterate, we're not talking about integrations here. We're talking about configuration. We're talking about connectors. We're talking about templates. So we can really reduce the cost required to get up and running with the Power Platform. So to understand which application we should use, I just have a little chart or diagram that I want to show you on the screen here to understand exactly what the pros and cons are of each type of application. And what you'll find with the Power Platform and Dynamics 365 is there's normally 5 different ways to implement the same thing. There's always a best practice way, but there's always different ways that you can do depending on your bespoke requirements and if the best practice way doesn't quite fit. So generally speaking, I'm not going to go through each one of these line by line, but let's say, for example, you need a fully customizable user interface and you need mobile availability. Well, actually, that could be a Canvas app and that could be a portal. The reason it wouldn't quite be a model-driven application is because we can tailor the items that we have on the sitemap. We can tailor the forms and the fields that we see on them, but that structure of having the navigation on the left-hand side and some of the quick actions at the top, we can't change that whatsoever. Another example, if we need external audiences, then we're normally driven towards the portal applications. But there are some ways that we can do things with external audiences via Azure Active Directory for the other applications. It's just that your first thought would be a portal in that particular sense because you're controlling exactly what they have access to via a data window. The one thing I do want everyone to pay attention to on this screen, though, is the likeliness of code requirements. And that's really because of the history of the product and how that's come a long way from the original Dynamics CRM product. So anyone that's familiar with Dynamics CRM that's now transitioned into Dynamics 365 will be familiar with the ability to create plugins or write JavaScript if the configuration options don't allow you to do something. With the introduction of Canvas apps, Power Automate, business rules, which are now kind of well-established and stable features now for the last 4 or so years, and other pieces of functionality, it's very unlikely that we need code requirements for model-driven applications. So if you just need something to configure, if you're trained on Dataverse and you know how to put a sitemap together, you're likely to be able to hit your requirements quite easily without writing any code. With Canvas and Portal, however, we have a slightly different approach. So Canvas, we have to understand the PowerFX programming language. Like I say, it's the kind of language that's very lightweight. You need one statement per component. It's the kind of thing where, like I say, if you can look at VLOOKUPs and confidently add those and look at the references that Excel would give you in the formula bar, then you'll be absolutely fine with Canvas apps to get started. Whereas with portals, because that's a website, you're often looking at traditional web development methods if you need to extend that product. And a common example is needing to add analytics to the portal so you can see user behavior. So that's a comparison of the applications and when we should and when we shouldn't use those. Let's just have a look at licensing before we have a look at the Quantix and portal example. So the licensing is really split into 2 different pots. We have model-driven app and Canvas, which are per user per month. And in this particular example, you can see the minimum unit is £7.50 for 2 applications. What that means is a user can be assigned any 2 of those combination of applications. They'll have access to them. There might be some caveats around the tables you can use if you've got a complicated architecture and design with other people accessing other pieces of data from Dynamics 365 and things like that. But generally speaking, that's the minimum price to get started. You then have the ability to go up to approximately £30 per user per month, and that will give you access to unlimited apps. But then we also have the level of 7160, which is Dynamics 365 for sales, customer service, marketing, and field service. Now, the thing to consider is on the screen, Dynamics 365 looks relatively expensive in comparison to the Power Apps cost. But what you need to remember is the Dynamics 365 products are full operational processes that have been built for a particular industry scenario. So for example, customer service, it allows you to have SLAs that vary based on conditions with trigger, warning, and breaches. It allows you to have workload management with queues and automatic syncing of mailboxes and workload management. You also have the ability to kind of categorize your cases, make parent and child references, and then start to work out the trends of issues that people are raising. Now, If you try to say, okay, I'm going to go for one of the less expensive licenses, and I'm going to try and recreate that functionality myself, you'd actually find that your project cost for implementation is going to be much, much higher and quite significant, because there's a lot of automation that Microsoft provide within that license that's not available in the cheaper licenses. And therefore you'd have to recreate that functionality, which is not recommended at all. So like I say, on the face of it, when you compare £7.50 to £71.60, it looks like a massive jump, but when you look at the functionality in detail and how you get started, it's very, very cost effective. We then move on to the portal side of things, and portal licensing is considered units. So the units are split in two. The first type of unit is per login per 24 hours, and the second type is per page view, and if you're not logged in. So again, this is showing you the minimum units. For frequent users and high volume turnover on the portal, this does become a hell of a lot cheaper per page view and per login per 24 hours as you go up the tiers. So Microsoft offer 5 tiers of volumes for this particular type of licensing. And it kind of caters for every business scenario, whether you're a low volume organization or whether you're a high volume organization. The only thing to remember is that if you're an internal user and you're utilizing a portal for self-serve purposes, such as using knowledge bases and forums, you do have to be licensed for the Power Apps, and you don't consume one of the portal units. So if you're only using portals for internal use, you have to be really careful to make sure that you're licensed in the correct way. So that's a high-level overview of the licensing. Let's now move on to Quantix System Portal, which I've got a series of screenshots for you in the interest of time. Just gives you a very, very high-level overview of what you could do with each type of application in each scenario. So the context of Quantix Citizen Portal is that it's for public sector organizations that need to communicate in a more consistent and modern way. I don't know about you on the audience, but I find that when I'm talking to my council, I send in a form that's on their website that then goes into a mailbox. Someone has to interpret that at the council, and then I eventually get a response that's personalized, even if it's being categorized on the form on the website. Now, using the Power Platform can change that, because we move away from email mechanisms and effectively front ends that put things into mailboxes, and we put things into categorized tables specifically about those types of issues. What we can also do is we can then convert that into tables that can be recognized by Dynamics 365 products, such as customer service. So we're able to change the terminology depending on who's using the functionality. So a citizen, if they have a bin issue, all they care about is the fact that their bin has gone missing. They need a new one to turn up on their doorstep. They don't necessarily need to track it along the way. But ultimately, they're not someone that's in the tech industry. They just want to talk about their bin. However, in the council, you want to treat all of your issues like a help desk style operation. So in that particular scenario, we need to make sure we're adapting the terminology for the right audience in the right time. And we have the portal for the citizen, and we have the model-driven app for the help desk operation behind the scenes. And one thing to note is that this utilizes every part of the Power Platform except for Power Virtual Agents. This is just simply because of the purpose of this proof of value product. It's not because of any limitations within Power Virtual Agents or anything like that. So to start us off, we have the model-driven app, and the model-driven app provides a series of dashboards, and it provides our window into resident information and into inquiry or case information. So what you can see on here is a manager dashboard, and I have data here about all of the different types of issues that we face in this particular scenario, but I also have data in here relating to Google Analytics that's sitting behind the portal. So dashboards within model-driven apps, they give us the ability to add Power BI kind of tiles or reports into our dashboard. So Google Analytics is hooked up to the portal. I'm receiving the data via Power BI, and then I'm embedding that tile into the dashboard. And the configuration required for that is relatively simple, but it just means as an end user, I only have to look at this window. I don't have to keep open, my model-driven app for customer service, my Google Analytics, and my Power BI as 3 different tabs in the window. So the reason we use dashboards is really to kind of identify trends and see if we can stop the number of cases or issues or anything coming through moving forward. As you can see in this example, we've got a spike of bin issues in my test system, and we can say, hang on a minute, what happened in that week for us to have so many issues? Is it that a road was closed and our bin lorries couldn't get round to all of the residential streets? Did we not publish this information on our website that we were changing the type of bin that we're collecting this week, etc., etc.? And hopefully we'll start to make improvements in our behavior to stop so many cases coming in moving forward. Once we move past the dashboard and we start looking at the tables, you can start looking at some of the other data that's coming through into the system. So in this particular set of screenshots here, we've got a household and we've got a contact. So the contact comes from the core tables that are provided by the Power Platform, and we've just extended it for this scenario. The household is a completely custom table, and what we're doing is we're associating the contacts as residents to the household using Power Automate. And whilst I'm not doing a live demo here, if you can imagine, we have a council tax number on the summary tab on this screenshot. When that changes, Power Automate will go away and look at the number of household records we have in the background with that council tax number, and it will automatically add the resident to that household. If the resident is already a part of another household, it will also automatically transfer them over from one to the other. So there's lots of automatic things we can do in the background via Power Automate, which is fantastic, requires no intervention from the end user at all. And we can change the way that this form works in the model-driven application using something called business rules. So another example is if you see towards the kind of bottom half of the screen, we've got the is vulnerable and is minor check kind of flip switches there. They are controlled by business rules, so that if any one of those is marked as red, yes, rather than red, it will automatically show a parent or guardian form underneath to be able to specify who's looking after them if they are vulnerable or they are a minor. Okay. The next part of the model-driven application is really categorizing requests and converting them into cases. So part of the request is custom. That's something we've built. So we've built it around the terminology in this industry scenario. And then we have the case record, which is provided by Microsoft via the Dynamics 365 customer service product. So within this particular scenario, the portal user will raise the request and they will fill in a bin issue form, which we're going to see very soon. That will come through to the request record that you can see on the screenshot that's behind the case record there. And then Power Automate will automatically convert that into a case for the end user to see. Now the end user can always go back to the original bin issue details. They don't just have to look at the case record, but that then blends the best of both worlds. You have the bin specific information from the citizen. We're not alienating them from a technical point of view. We also have the help desk style management of the issue in the back end that all of our end users can use internally. And then last but not least, for the model-driven app, as we said earlier, our portal is driven by data that's stored in Dataverse. So rather than having to come back to a partner like Quantix every time you want to change your set of locations, the color of your bins and the type of bins you've got, etc., we can actually store that data in Dataverse and we can surface it into a model-driven app. So for this fictitious council, if they need to add new locations, they simply need their IT administrator to add the new locations to this database table via the new button at the top of the screen. We don't need to go back to our partner to be able to configure new functionality every time we need this type of data. And you can see some examples on the left-hand side. We've got our locations, bin collection dates, announcements, bin types, etc., etc. So there's a whole host of these in the product. So as we move on to the Canvas app, there's actually 2 pieces of functionality that we can use here to use them for 2 distinct purposes. The first one is embedding a Canvas app into our model-driven app that already exists. So on the right-hand side, that is a very lightweight Canvas app that gives us information to help us support the creation of the record on the left-hand side. So if I need to understand what a page template looks like, traditionally I can't do that in a model-driven app to see a visual preview of what that is. So my Canvas app on the right-hand side allows me to view the different types of templates, show me an image preview of that so I can make the selection on the left-hand side. On the Canvas app, if you're using them standalone rather than embedded as a model-driven app application and a wider solution, you can make these as kind of purposeful as you need for users on the go or a particular target audience based on a particular scenario. So what we've done here is we've created a Canvas app that someone on the bin lorry can operate. Relatively simple application, but it just gives us another window into that same single source of truth in the backend in Dataverse. So in this particular example, the latitude and longitude are automatically populated as well as the date of issue. That just saves time for the operative who's operating this app on their device, but it also means we don't have to worry about finding out the address if we don't know it. So you can see first line of address and postcode are optional. What we don't want is our bin operatives going around trying to match bins to houses just to be able to log an issue. So this can give us enough information to tell us where the lorry was at that time. We can give the additional details if we can, and then we can automatically populate other things based on categorizations and the circumstances that sit around the device that's on the that's running the application. And then last but not least, we have the portal. So the portal, you've seen this screenshot already, but this gives a My Account style experience to any citizen that wants to log in, and it uses traditional web development components to integrate to the Power Platform. So anyone that's familiar with web development, the portal product uses Bootstrap as a framework. If you go and Google that or use Bing after the session and look at Bootstrap and examples of that, you'll start to notice it's a very well popular kind of used tool in the web industry for all sorts of different purposes on websites. So it's a My Account style experience, as we said before. You can log in if you want to get that tailored experience of categorizations, terminology that's specific to issues and things like that. You can also browse the website by not logging in and just looking at generic information. You can still submit forms if you're not logged in, but you're not going to get that tailored experience that you expect if you do log in. The other thing I wanted to say about this really is that all we're really doing here is we're just exposing different parts of the Power Platform in a safe and secure way via the mechanisms that Microsoft have given us already. And I know that's kind of a self-explanatory and kind of obvious statement, but what I want to reiterate here again is that we're not using integrations. You know, we're talking about content and the display of that content. We're not talking about how we're going to integrate Dataverse with the portal, and it can massively save us some time here. We just have a couple of other screenshots to go through on the portal. So the first one is just an example of a form that's been tailored for the citizen using that citizen-like terminology. This form is completely blank, but you can see they can start to add different types of data based on the type of the field in Dataverse. So a bin type is a reference to another table. So you see a dialog with different options available. The date is a date picker. And then obviously the other fields are free text there, apart from the radio button bottom. And then last but not least, in this very high level overview, just showing you what you can do and how you can kind of transform the data in Dataverse. So we don't have to show everyone a whole list of all of their issues. As we said, in this particular scenario, the citizen doesn't necessarily care about the progress of their case. What they care about is if there is an ongoing case and whether it's been resolved. So we've created this summary page that allows you to just see everything that's related to you once you're logged in. You can see the status that's related to that particular area. And what we've built in recently, I don't have a screenshot today, unfortunately, because it's in dev, but you can expand on those tabs and you can see the issues if you want to. So it's all about just bringing all of that data together in Dataverse, and we can display it in exactly the way we want to on the portal front end. So the last topic from me then will be single sources of truth. And this is just really, again, to reiterate and emphasize the fact that Dataverse can be so powerful when we start to consider our data model and where all of this data is coming from. So it's just one diagram here before we move over to Scott. And it's just really to represent how some of these typical examples are being used in Quantix Citizen Portal. So if we have a look at contact, for example, the contact represents a resident on the model-driven application for the internal end user. And from a portal perspective, it represents who logs in into the portal. So two different purposes for two different audiences, but we're using exactly the same data for both applications. For the case record, the portal user will see the case reference, but they don't see the help desk style operation. They see the terminology that relates to them in terms of the bin issue or the other type of issue that they're raising. Whereas the internal end user on the model-driven application, their core functionality is all based around the case to allow them to manage that issue and get the resolution to the citizen as quickly as possible. The request is actually interacting with all three types of applications. So the request is used to look at the original details for the internal user that's managing the case. And then for the Canvas app, it's the operative on the bin lorry. For the portal, it's the end user that is the citizen raising the query in the first place. So again, just a different window into the same data. And then last but not least, we have locations. So locations are important for us to identify issues in car parks, around bin scenarios, around recycling centers, et cetera, We're surfacing different information from the location entity on both the Canvas app for the person that's on the go, and also for the citizen that is trying to raise the issue themselves. Okay. So thank you very much for listening. That's a very high level overview of the Power Apps functionality, Power Platform functionality, and Dynamics 365, an example of the Quantix Citizen Portal where we're utilizing all three types of applications. And if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll try to answer them at the end. But for now, I'll hand over to Scott.
Thanks, Aaron. Hopefully you can all hear me. Yeah, it's very insightful. But I'm here to talk about, as Aaron's done such a great job of the capability, I want to give sort of on the ground insight into our Power Platform adoption. So yeah, I'm Scott Attry, so I'm Applications Delivery Manager at Norfolk County Council. If you go on to the next slide, Aaron. I'll just do a quick agenda. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Norfolk County Council, our approach to the Power Platform adoption, some key events and timelines of how we've carried that out, some examples of some of the Power Apps that we've created, and some top tips in governance and what we're planning to do next. So quick introduction. So at Norfolk County Council, we're a top tier county, predominantly based in Norwich. We've got about 7,000 staff and we provide services to just under 1 million residents. So for a bit of context, so I work in the IMT team in business applications, and we're quite a small team. I'm the manager of that team. We're supported by sort of project manager, a small team of mainly .NET developers, but also quite closely aligned to some business analysts who work closely with the business customers. But sort of the key thing here that I wanted to elaborate on is that we have a digital strategy, and part of that transformation strategy that Sam mentioned at the beginning was to adopt the Power Platform and the Microsoft technologies, and also about consolidating our apps. So projects that come through our program, we're very much about delivering them in an IMT way, but we also have the initiative to empower our users, our staff, to build out solutions utilizing the technology to solve their own problems. So, next slide. Thanks. I'm just going to talk about our approach. So someone I think mentioned licensing in the chat. So at an enterprise level, supported by Bytes, we purchased the Microsoft E5 licensing. And what that did is it gave everyone across the entire organization access to consume Power BI reporting, Power Apps, Canvas apps, and Power Automate. And that's kind of where we started. We coined the term service-led development because obviously trying to empower those users meant that we were initially providing an IMT-assisted approach, but essentially it's allowing what Microsoft refers to as citizen development, so empowering our employees to build out solutions. So, how do we do that? Where do we start? We started by defining what our operating model was, so what people we needed, what processes came with that, what technology was included in that stack. So not just the Power Platform, there's lots of other automation tools out there, including RPA, including APIs, etc. But the Power Platform was very much at the core. So how do we engage with the business? We used our business analysts because they're the experts in that. and they did that initial assessment, working within a startup group, finding those defining those requirements with the business and looking at a range of different solutions that we could get started with. So, it came later, but I think it's relevant. At the very beginning, we kind of realised that we'd need to upskill and build and grow that digital community. There's lots of early adopters within the business, but it's very much trying to identify them, bring them on board, and then define a community that could help make it grow. Next slide, please, Aaron. So just a quick timeline. I won't go through all the detail, but yeah, it's back in 2019 where we purchased that licensing. We were immediately sort of, because the licensing allowed us to consume Power BI, lots of interest from the business around insights and dashboards. And that's where we kind of initially started. But where it sort of mainly began was back in the early stages of the pandemic. We obviously had a project to adopt Microsoft Teams really quickly. Something we turned around, in a couple of months, where traditionally we've taken much longer than that. But that gave us the right structure to be agile, to work quickly, to work on projects, and define this sort of working group that allowed us to start this adoption process. So sort of late 2020 was the first time we started building Canvas apps and flows. And that was very much led by the IMT team, but with a view of obviously getting those service-led citizen developers onboarded to solve their own solutions. So, I joined the team in January. The first thing that we wanted to focus on was around governance and controlling and having an overview of our estate. And we installed something that's called the Centre of Excellence Starter Kit. It's from Microsoft. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but it gives you ability to monitor and govern, those apps and flows and Power BI, etc. that's created in the background. So.
Sorry, apologies. We appear to have run into a technical issue.
I'm back now.
Oh, you're back. Perfect.
Yeah, sorry, I just dropped out there. I don't know where you got to.
No worries.
Should I just continue for the next slide? Did you get the end of this one?
It's been cut off for about 30 seconds or so, Scott.
Yeah,
so
about 30 seconds.
Okay, so I'll sort of jump in from sort of January 2021, where we installed the Centre of Excellence Toolkit.
Yeah.
It allowed us to essentially monitor and govern our apps and flows that were created on our tenant and on our estate. And more recently, we've been instigated a sort of digital skills setup, and we've got sort of dedicated learning and development and courses and intro sessions and roundtable and app building events. So it's really beginning to take off. Next slide, please, Aaron. So just a couple of those sort of IMT existed examples. In the early beginning, we developed like a pipeline management tool. So essentially it's an assessment tool that allows you to assess business processes and see if they're suitable either for a power up or an automation. And then they can add those opportunities where they're assessed. And then we've integrated it with Power BI that gives us a healthy pipeline of automations to tackle. The next one is a desk booking app. So that's a Canvas app. That's got built-in sort of Power Automate as well, that automates emails and alerts. And that's something that we took from a template and we customized it ourselves, and we turned around to build in a number of days, where in a traditional sense it would have taken a lot longer than that. And then the final one is just something that we're experimenting with that is also part of the Power Platform, and that's the embedded Power Virtual Agent, so a chat bot that we're using for our school submissions. and that's been really successful, and there's lots of other opportunities for us to embed that into our dynamic solution as well. So the next slide is a couple of these service-led examples. So these are what people within the business have created. This one is a smarter working assessment tool. It's just a novel app that essentially creates everything in a Power BI background and captures some useful insight. It can be done on people's mobile phones, so it helps them engage. The next one is a document box archiving tool, quite powerful. It utilizes QR code scanning. We have physical storage boxes that we store in a warehouse, and this is a real quick and easy way to scan that code, bring up the box, edit it. Changing a process that would have taken 15 minutes can now be done in seconds. So been really positive out there in the business. And then the final example is one that we've called Lone Worker Notification App. So we had an application that already did this that we no longer use, and essentially it allows users out in the field, when they're working by themselves, they can alert their manager that they've returned safely home, with Power Automate integrated in the background that triggers off an email, and also puts in mobile numbers, etc. So if they don't return, that they can reach out and follow the necessary process. So some top tips. So we started somewhere. We just following those licenses, we really kicked off with the Canvas app. So what I would say is, if you are a public sector or an enterprise, look at your Office 365, because that licensing doesn't just give you access to Power Platform, it gives you access to the whole Office suite. We started with Canvas apps due to that licensing. There is additional licensing with ModelDriven apps. We started with good data, and a good recommendation is that if you're utilizing SharePoint lists, there's a really useful tool there where it will create a Power App for you off the SharePoint list. And then, as Aaron mentioned in the beginning, it's like those Excel-like functions that really enables you to build out a really powerful Power App, very quickly. A useful thing at a sort of an enterprise level as well is around a sort of encouraging innovation. There's lots of worry about users building apps, them sitting there not being used. And in our tenant, we have what we call a productivity environment. So it allows people to build apps freely and they can share them. But for anything that's more, business critical or departmental, you can store in another environment that is completely separated, controlled, like any other sort of .NET or other business application would be. So really following those application management principles as and when needed. So using the right tools is also a good recommendation. There's lots of templates, as Aaron mentioned, within the Power Studio where you can an asset management tool or a survey, and equally there's lots online. So around GitHub and templates, and more sites are springing up. So the other thing I would really focus on is about taking governance seriously. So I mentioned about installing the Centre of Excellence Starter Toolkit. What it does, it really gives you an overview. It's a combination of model-driven apps and Canvas apps and flows that sits on your tenant and gives you a holistic view of what's happening. I've got a couple of screenshots on the next slide, which I'll show you, but there's a couple of other useful sort of links. If you are a public sector or government, there's a Microsoft forum and all of those. Lots and lots of different councils are on there, all sharing ideas and recommendations and even apps in some cases. So there's a useful Microsoft link that I would definitely recommend checking out, and it's called the Power Cat Adoption Model, and it really gives you some good starting points on how you go through that Power Platform adoption journey and getting started and how you evolve that. So they're really useful there. Next slide, Aaron. So sort of governance, Centre of Excellence Toolkit. There's a couple of screenshots there to give you an overview. So the top one is the Power Platform dashboard. It's a model-driven app, and it gives you complete insight of who in your tenant has built apps. So the app makers, it allows you to monitor the environments for those departmental solutions, the Power Automate flows, and also the connectors. So connectors for reference I think there's about 200 available within the Power Platform, and that can link to anything like Twitter or Salesforce or SQL servers, etc. At a premium cost. But what we did is implemented a thing we call the DLP, which is the data loss prevention policy, and it allows you to restrict those connectors down to Microsoft only, so data can't be transferred, you know, when it shouldn't be externally outside of the business. There's also an app archive process for those users that have created those apps that are, you know, were just experiment, no longer needed. Gives you that view, and then you can take ownership and then archive and even delete those apps out of the tenant. Next slide. So what are we doing next? So you know, I think Aaron's presentation was excellent and really was really clear on that Dataverse. You know, we're coming to that point now where we've, you know, we're comfortable with the platform and the technology, and we're adopting that culture of innovation and looking at that single view of the customer to help transform that experience. And I think the Dataverse is key to that, alongside the model-driven apps. So we have a couple of those around our vulnerability hub and COVID response, and we're looking to try and integrate and work more closely with our Dynamics 365 platform in that respect. So same with premium connectors. There's lots of opportunities there around SQL Server and other connectors, etc. So we are focusing heavily on that service-led development initiative. Currently got over 50 app makers, and that's growing. We've got a sort of program of work where people are, you know, we're demoing their own apps, doing, you know, what they're referring to as hackathons or challenges, Dragon style, then you know, based requirements, and who can build out the, you know, the best solutions. But one of the key things that I'm most excited about is developing the Centre of Excellence and reusable components. Once you've built a template or built some branding or built some you know, barcode component, it can be saved, it can be stored, and it can be shared, and it can be reused. So people don't have to repeat that coding again. So when they come to delivering those solutions, they'll be much quicker. You can fully integrate them in teams, and that rollout of the solution is hopefully going to go from, you know, weeks and months to you know, to hours and days, and that's kind of the approach that we're taking. So, and then equally we're collaborating with lots of other councils on the local regional government forum and GitHub templates, and you know, as part of the reason for this call is to happily reach out and support and help you know, other like-minded organizations. So yeah, I'm trying to summarize by saying that the Microsoft Power Platform has been, you know, truly transformational for us, and I feel it's just the beginning of our journey. And that's probably it for me.
Thanks very much, guys. Some really interesting content there. Thanks, Aaron, for presenting some of those key concepts and platform capabilities, and Scott for helping bring that to life with the Power Platform story at Norfolk. Coming to the end, but I did just want to touch upon the fact that there are multiple different ways that we can provide services and support on your Power Apps journey and really enhance your understanding of what the platform can do. One of these is the App in a Day workshop, which you can see on the screen now. This is a really great way to immerse yourself in the technology, enhance your understanding of the platform capabilities, explore the art of the possible, and really start to envision the types of apps that can be created in your organization that will be of value and ultimately solve existing challenges and pain points that you might have. These will be, it's a completely tailored workshop to your organization as well. So the approach is really to look at your challenges, your goals, and tailor conversation around building applications accordingly. So we'll ensure that it's a relevant session. You can declare your level of interest in these workshops on a poll that should be on your screen now. So feel free to obviously say yes, no, or perhaps you're interested, but you know, want to review it really further down the line when you've got resource to. And really just from my side, just to mention that this is one of our many out-of-the-box offerings and one of the many areas we can support. So Scott did a really good job talking to the governance piece that many organizations need support on. So perhaps if you're further down the road with your Power Apps consumption and you're now thinking, well, how do we ensure that we have the necessary guardrails set up internally to really govern, nurture, and really monitor that adoption of Power Apps? Well, the governance workshop could really be of use to you. So, you know, Scott really described the value of that Center of Excellence starter kit and how useful that can be to download. I think he would probably talk to the value as well of potentially having some support in customizing that and implementing it in an optimal way. So yeah, if there's any other areas that you you know, if there's any other areas that you feel you may need support as well in relation to Power Apps, then obviously reach out to help me at bytes.co.uk, and we'll get a call set up to see how we can support you. Conscious that we have run out of time, but we are, as promised, going to get to a few questions. So thanks all for staying on the call. I can see we still have quite a few people on, so that's great. So just going to field some questions back to primarily Aaron. I did see a few questions around sort of pricing the Dataverse, Aaron. So can you just clarify whether that is a sort of standalone solution cost, or does it come included with the likes of Power Apps, Dynamics, etc.?
Absolutely. So it's one of those depends answers, really. It depends how you're currently licensed and what you want to achieve on Dataverse. So for example, I saw a question there specifically around SharePoint. If you're already licensed for SharePoint and to access that data, then you have the ability to create apps on top as long as you're licensed to be able to use Power Apps. There's the concept of premium connectors in the Power Platform. So for example, some connectors will only allow you with additional licensing, whereas other connectors will allow you to use the license that you've already got. When it comes to things like Dynamics 365 functionality and access to tables that are in those, for any types of the applications, you have to have the Dynamics 365 license.
Great stuff. And it's worth pointing out as well that for the Power Platform, so particularly with Power Apps and Automate, for example, there are capacity add-ons available that entitle you to extra daily Power Platform requests per unit if that is something you require. And also from a Dynamics perspective, you get a certain amount of Dataverse storage included, but you can also accrue storage at a rate of 250 meg per enterprise license that's on the plan. So hopefully that clarifies a bit there. It was a bit on the licensing front. I saw a few relating to licensing as well, Aaron. So the business users within an organization have to be licensed for model or canvas driven apps? Well, the answer essentially is yes, there isn't it? And when in terms of basically either via the standalone options, obviously the per app, whether you go via the per app route or via the per user route, either way they're going to have to be licensed. If not by the standalone route, then potentially by having, you know, a full E5 license, which grants you usage of Power Apps and Power BI, but purely in an Office 365 context. So, and similarly with Dynamics, yes, you're granted rights to use Power Apps, but again, that's in the context of customizing and extending your existing Dynamics application within the same environment, essentially. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that as well. It's really worth kind of instigating a conversation with Bytes around licensing, just purely for the fact that you've probably already got some sort of license for something in your Microsoft tenant. So the combination of licenses you may require and what you already have access to will vary per person or per organization.
Absolutely. In terms of a question came in around SharePoint forms using Power Apps, and which app would that come under, or which app would be sort of the typical route there?
So if it was just SharePoint, it would be Canvas apps. So model-driven apps are purely based on Dataverse, and portals use Dataverse as the data source as well. So you have to go down the Canvas app route for that one.
Cool. And do they have the possibility to add business rules to model-driven apps to make certain fields mandatory based on a item status, for example?
Absolutely. So the context is the table, the form that you're currently looking at. So it has to be available for you on that particular screen. But you can use business rules to do things like set fields mandatory. You can do the opposite and set them optional. You can show and hide. You can populate values and things like that.
Okay. And are we able to clarify what classes a user as internal versus external?
Yeah, sure. So an internal user is anyone that is a full, well, normally these days as your Active Directory user. So anyone that's working for your organization that has a email address at your domain under the organizational account mechanism rather than the personal account mechanism from Microsoft. An external user is anyone that's effectively the opposite. So they don't have your domain, they're not in your Azure Active Directory, or they could be in your Azure Active Directory, but as a guest instead.
Okay, that's great. Just going to do one more because we've already gone 5 minutes over. Someone's coming in and said they have quite a complex SQL Server data warehouse. Would you import that into Dataverse or use direct query?
There's a number of ways to do this, so I wouldn't necessarily say yes or no to this question. I would say that you should explore the Azure route because you might want to create some sort of phased or staging process to get your SQL Server data warehouse into Azure if it's not already, and then look at the ability through Power Automate and Logic Apps to then start moving that over to Dataverse. I think if you kind of take the full scale of the data warehouse and try and put that into Dataverse straight away, it might be a little bit too much too quickly.
Yeah, understood. I think that's some good advice. And we've had a few questions just relating to the actual recording of the session. So yes, this session has been recorded. I know there's a few issues with people joining at the start, but rest assured, if you did miss the first part of the session, the recording will be available, and we'll make sure the link to which goes out to all attendees. But yeah, that's going to be it for today's session. I hope you found it valuable use of your time. From looking through some of the comments, that appears to be the case. So that's really great to hear. I'll be speaking to some of you around our services and how we can support fairly shortly, I'm sure. And apart from that, take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Aaron and Scott, for your time today, and thanks to everyone who joined the event.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.